Although dinosaurs came in a variety of sizes, the long-necked sauropods truly live up to the public perception of dinosaurian giants. They possessed numerous specializations to reach gargantuan sizes and included the largest animals to ever walk on land. To be small by sauropod standards merely meant being under the weight of an elephant, and even the smallest sauropods, such as Europasaurus, were still about the same size as horses or cows. These dwarfs usually lived on isolated islands, environments where there were simply not enough resources to sustain a population of giants. Since the same evolutionary pressure acted on the local island-dwelling carnivores, the same predator-prey dynamics on the mainland continued. But since size was a sauropod's primary form of defense, it was thought dwarf sauropods could not survive on the mainland due to its greater dangers. This view has recently changed following the discovery of a new dwarf sauropod named Ibirania. Despite measuring just 5.7 meters long, it lived on mainland South America during the late Cretaceous period, long after the evolution of large megatheropod dinosaurs. This, relatively speaking, tiny sauropod has demonstrated that Mesozoic ecosystems were much more complex than previously thought. Ibirania's fossils originate from the São José do Rio Preto Formation in southern Brazil, which was formed 85 million years ago. This formation belongs to the larger Bauru Basin, which records the majority of the late Cretaceous fossil record of the region. As in the rest of the southern hemisphere, the dominant large herbivores from the Bauru Basin were titanosaurs, the only branch of sauropods left by the late Cretaceous. The full scientific name of this dwarf sauropod, Ibirania parva, means Little Ibera Wanderer, Ibera being the municipality all Ibirania fossils have been found in. However, since Ibera is derived from an indigenous word for tree, it can also mean Little Tree Wanderer. Ibirania is currently known from 4 specimens. As can be seen here, even when all 4 are used to form a composite, most of the skeleton remains missing. However, these fossils are sufficient to calculate its size using close relatives to fill in the gaps, and the bones contain enough distinctive features to be diagnostic. Still, given the sparsity of fossils, it would at first seem easy to dismiss the Ibirania specimens as misidentified juveniles. After all, many animals die before they are fully grown, and the populations of sauropods in particular were skewed towards juveniles, with relatively few adult individuals in a given environment. However, the neurocentral sutures of the Ibirania vertebrae had fused completely, meaning the animals had already ceased growing before they died. Furthermore, the extensive pneumatic or hollow spaces of their bones closely matched those of adult titanosaurs. Finally, the interior of the bones of the holotype and one other specimen display extensive secondary remodeling, which is indicative that they were not merely fully grown, but elderly at the time of their deaths. Therefore, the Ibirania holotype wasn't simply a juvenile or even an atypical specimen, but belonged to a genuine species of dwarf sauropod. As for why such a tiny sauropod was on the mainland, it is hypothesized to be the extreme conclusion of 2 different evolutionary trends. The other members of Ibirania's subclade of Titanosauria, Saltasaurinae, were already small compared to other sauropods. Many of the island dwarfs, such as Magyarosaurus, were even close relatives to the Saltasaurines. Therefore, Ibirania is merely the most extreme example of a lineage that had already been shrinking in size. Saltasaurines were also less dependent on their size for protection, as they were covered in bony dermal plates called osteoderms. Still, in a typical Mesozoic ecosystem, a mini sauropod like Ibirania would have remained highly vulnerable. This leads into the other factor behind Ibirania's small size, its native environment. Most of the other sauropods found in the Bauru Basin were only between 8 to 12 meters long. While far from dwarfs, this is smaller than the sauropod faunas of Argentina and the rest of the southern hemisphere. The paleo environment of late Cretaceous Brazil was arid, which the authors of the paper which described Ibirania hypothesized was the reason for the smaller body size of the local longnecks. An arid climate would have limited the available food supply and therefore the size of the Brazilian titans, with Ibirania once again being the most extreme example of a greater evolutionary trend. While one may think that the smaller Saltosaurines would have thrived in such an arid climate, Ibirania is actually the first and currently only known member of Saltosaurinae that has been found in Brazil. This could suggest that the evolutionary dynamics behind the diminutive nature of the clade didn't simply drive them into a small absolute size in isolation of the rest of the environment, but encouraged them to be proportionally smaller than the other species of the sauropods around them. Much like on the contemporary isolated islands, smaller herbivores meant late Cretaceous Brazil was home to smaller predators. For instance, the abelosaurid Thanos simonatoi, who was named after the Marvel villain, was about the same size as the apex predators on the islands of Europe. However, while the other dwarf sauropods like Magyarosaurus were the largest local plant eaters in their environment, Ibirania was the smallest of the Brazilian sauropods. It would have been far more vulnerable to the apex predator of the region, an as of yet unnamed member of Megaraptora, a clade famous for their massive claws. Likewise, Ibirania was small enough that adults were not only in danger from other dinosaurs. A major branch of primarily terrestrial crocodilomorphs called notosuchians were abundant throughout the southern continents during the late Cretaceous, and the Bauru Basin was home to several carnivorous subclades, such as the Parasaurids and the Baurusuchids, whose members grew several meters long. Just one of these could threaten the little tree wanderer, and a pack could have taken down many of the larger Baurusauropods. These non-dinosaurian reptiles were able to grow so large in an otherwise dinosaur-dominated world as a result of the same evolutionary pressure that made Ibirania so small. Dinosaurs were endotherms, with high metabolisms which required enormous amounts of food, which is why they became smaller in the arid, resource-sparse climate of late Cretaceous Brazil. On the other hand, notosuchian crocodilomorphs were ectotherms, meaning they required less food than their dinosaurian cousins, allowing them to rise in the Bauru food chain. Due to its relatively smaller size, Ibirania's diet may have been very different from those of both the contemporary Brazilian sauropods and the island dwarfs. However, this remains speculation due to its missing skull, which is an unfortunately common occurrence even among sauropods known from otherwise more complete remains. Sauropod skulls are a rarity in the fossil record, as the weight-saving measures they evolved in order to place less strain on their necks meant their skull bones were delicate and easily fell apart after they died. Despite its small size, Ibirania seems to have been no exception. Likewise, as in other sauropods, many of its postcranial bones were pneumatic or hollow, much like the bones of birds. Such spaces in modern birds are filled with air sacs connected to their respiratory systems, and examination of the interior of Ibirania's bones found these hollow spaces were surrounded by pneumostium, a type of bone tissue that is a correlate of these air sacs. Although the last common ancestor of birds and sauropods did not have a pneumatic skeleton, the basic system appears to predate the first dinosaurs. The lungs of crocodilians, the closest living relatives of the dinosaurs, have a great deal in common with those of birds, suggesting their last common ancestor already had an avian-like respiratory system. From there, it would have been relatively simple for evolution to independently modify the air sacs to invade the bones. Indeed, some of the closest relatives of the dinosaurs, the pterosaurs, also converged upon an avian-like pneumatic skeleton. The crocodilian avian respiratory system exhibits unidirectional airflow and is much more efficient than the respiratory systems of other reptiles or mammals. It was the only one that would have been capable of providing the required quantities of oxygen to animals of such great size or with long necks as sauropod dinosaurs. Additionally, by invading the bones, the air sacs lightened the skeletons of these titans, allowing them to support their massive bulk. Whales, the only animals that reach sizes larger than sauropods, are unable to support their bodies out of the water and are often crushed to death by their own weight when beached. The avian-style system of air sacs also helps sauropods to cool off. As a result of the square-cubed law, the larger an animal is, the harder it is for them to shed excess heat. While today's elephants regularly struggle to avoid overheating, the sauropods would have baked themselves alive without their pneumatic, air sac-filled bones. Overall, These hollow bones were absolute necessities for animals as large as the typical sauropod, but were far less critical for one as small as Ibirania. The skeletons of young sauropods of equal size as Ibirania were not as pneumatic as those of adults, yet, as mentioned previously, the pneumatic spaces in its vertebrae match those of far larger adult titanosaurs. It is possible that Ibirania co-opted the avian-style respiratory system for an as-of-yet unknown function, but it is more likely that its highly pneumatic skeleton was simply a holdover from its larger ancestors that was retained simply because it wasn't hurting anything. Sadly, examination of Ibirania's bone histology found that one of these animals was in a great deal of chronic pain before it died. A fibula belonging to one of the elderly specimens had become swollen and covered by lesions due to an infection. Inside were the fossilized remains of parasitic bloodworms, the first known example of parasites preserved within the fossilized bones of their host. The bloodworms resemble a larger version of the extinct bloodworm Paleoleishmania, but are over an order of magnitude larger than all definitive specimens belonging to this genus. It is unclear if the parasites were the primary cause of the pathologies affecting this Ibirania's fibula, or whether a different illness had facilitated their infestation into the bone. Regardless, the pain tormenting this single bone would have been immense, but the infection was likely widespread through the body and may have been responsible for this elderly dinosaur's death. Still, the fact that this Ibirania was able to reach old age demonstrates how successful this dwarf sauropod had become in spite of it shedding the massive size of its ancestors. While the island dwarf sauropods were already seen as unusual, Ibirania managed to outdo them by shrinking to the same size outside of the island environments of its counterparts. This was possible due to a mixture of a pre-existing propensity towards small size within its subclade of Titanosauria and the arid, resource-poor environment in what would become the Baru Basin. The discovery of the little tree wanderer has helped to demonstrate both the diversity of the dinosaurs and the prehistoric ecosystems they inhabited.
Thank you for watching, and a thank you to themattalorian for narrating this video. If you enjoyed it, please remember to hit the like button, and subscribe if you'd like to see more. Finally, be sure to have a great day.